Good evening and a very warm welcome to First Issues. Unemployment remains a worldwide challenge as countries continue their slow journey to recovery. A challenge that is exacerbated by rising job losses both abroad and here at home. Botswana's staggering 22% unemployment rate had to contend with 55 companies submitting notifications of intent to restructure and retrench in 2015. Along with diamond cutting and polishing companies were the Botswana Power Corporation, Botswana Housing Corporation, Diamond Trading Company Botswana, and many others. 2016 was also tough, with the highly publicized closures of BCL and Tati Nickel Mine resulting in a bittersweet festive season for hundreds of people. Tonight we address the questions that must arise for those directly affected by such job cuts. Questions such as, why me? What are my rights and responsibilities throughout this process? How will my exit package be decided? Is my retrenchment lawful? We're hoping that by demystifying the retrenchment process, we can make a potentially painful turn of events a much smoother one for all parties involved, especially in light of the exit package court cases that have surfaced locally. Recruitment consultant Sethunya Makepe joins us now, taking us through the entire retrenchment process, meant to protect both employer and employee rights as specified in the Employment Act.
Section 25 of the Employment Act is the one that actually places certain obligations on the employer who is contemplating retrenchments or is going through retrenchments. There are also principles of equity and fairness that the employer is required to follow if they are going to be going through an exercise such as this one. Now, the first requirement is that the employer who is contemplating retrenchments must inform the Commissioner of Labour as soon as they formulate the intention to retrench employees or to restructure their organization, or as soon as they realize that there's a need to look at their business in a different way. They need to inform the Commissioner of Labour. They then need to talk to the employees who are likely to be affected. So they must write them a letter as well to alert them of the fact that they do need to reconsider the way that they do business, the way that their business is operating. So that is the first obligation that the Employment Act would place on an employer: inform the Commissioner of Labour and inform those employees who are likely to be affected. Remember, at this point, the employer doesn't know the form or the shape that this exercise is going to take. So at this point, they need to then start engaging with the employees or their representatives if the employees are unionized. They need to start engaging with them on ways and means of averting the retrenchments, because the obligation of the employer is to try and avoid the retrenchments to the extent that they can. So the first discussion that the employer is holding with the unions or the representatives of the employees is to find ways and means of how the business could be improved without affecting employment.
It is good to know that due diligence is taken before the decision to retrench is made. What does happen, however, when there's no other recourse but to cut jobs?
Once it becomes obvious that retrenchments are going to become unavoidable because there is no alternative way of doing business, or there's no possibility of saving jobs, once that becomes obvious, then the employer has to continue the consultation process, but this time the agenda is different. Top on the agenda is how can we minimize the retrenchments? Some of the ways that you can consider are transferring people to alternative jobs that are available. It could be temporary layoffs. If the employer foresees that there's down the line there's opportunity for business to stabilize again, there could be temporary layoffs. And other means could be, or other alternatives that could be considered would be voluntary retrenchments, where people would be asked to volunteer to exit the organization. It could be early retirements. But in the first instance, we're trying to minimize, or the employer is trying to minimize the need to retrench. Having considered all those, all those other alternatives, and there's still a need to retrench people, then the discussion now should center around how do we select people to be retrenched. And paramount would be fairness. At the top of the list would be how do we select people fairly. The Employment Act stipulates last in, first out, or first in, last out. But obviously it also depends on the skills that you require in the new organization. It depends on a number of those factors. What does the organization need going forward? If your last employees to come into the organization are the best qualified and those with the skills that are required for the new organization, then you're not going to go retrenching those and leaving people who are no longer relevant to what the organization requires. So the law suggests last in, first out, however, having regard for the requirements of the organization. So that is the first thing that would need to be discussed, the criteria for selection. You then need to talk about the terms and conditions of the exit, or the terms and conditions of the retrenchment. What will be the timing of the retrenchments? What would be the severance benefits or the separation benefits when employees are being retrenched? Those are the discussions that the employer has to meaningfully engage with the trade unions or with the employees about. Those are the obligations that the law places on the employer. The aim of the law is really to ensure that there's equity and there's fairness in the way that the exercise is being carried out. And therefore, from an employer's perspective, it is to also ensure that you comply with the principles of equity and the principles of fairness.
It's time for a quick break, but when we return, our guest delves into the areas that result in the most contention during the retrenchment process. Welcome back as our guest consultant continues to help us understand the retrenchment process. Where do you see most misunderstandings occur in this process? Yes, there is a stipulated set process in the Act, but we do assume that there are hiccups along the way. Where do you see the most contentions arise?
Most of the contention would happen around the separation package. That is mostly where the issues arise. Before that even, the issue arises around whether this is a negotiable issue or whether it is actually only just a consultative issue, because employees expect to negotiate the process, they expect to negotiate the package, whereas the employer would in most instances be expecting to consult employees. Consultation meaning that we're soliciting views and inputs as an employer from employees, but in the end the decision lies with the employer. So that is where most of the disagreements, most of the disputes would revolve around. It would be around the package, it would be about the consultation. It is sometimes about the timing of the retrenchments where employees feel they didn't get enough time. Because on the other hand, for employers, when they make that decision or take that decision that they need to restructure or reorganize, or that the financial situation is such that they have to take a closer look at the business, it's usually urgent for the employer at that point. So it is at the point of timing That is where the point of departure usually is between the employers and the employees. The employees would like to see it as drawn out as possible whilst they're getting used to the fact that retrenchments are looming. The employer, on the other hand, would like to conclude the exercise in the shortest possible time that they can in order to stem the bleeding financially.
What does our guest typically have to advise employers to do during this process to make it a smooth one?
It's difficult on both parties. For employers, it's always important to talk to them about there being no shortcuts. You have to go, every step of the way. And the more time you can take consulting with people, the better. So what I often have to counsel employers on is on the fact that you really need to take your time so that you do it properly. Properly, not just properly, but also fairly, to make sure that you don't actually miss anything along the way.
What do you tell employees? How do you tell employees to manage and to best manage this difficult time?
It's obviously a very traumatic time for employees. It's a very uncertain period for employees, and they're always suspicious about the need for retrenchment because employees always feel that there could have been alternatives to the retrenchment. And at the end of the day, the employees, what we try and get them to understand that it is the employer's prerogative to decide what is best for their business. And therefore, the decision to retrench is not something that the employees can actually negotiate on, or the employees can actually, they cannot, I think at the end of the day, that's what it is, that they need to understand that it is the employer's prerogative, but that the employer will, they will not retrench for the sake of retrenching, and that, every endeavor is going to be taken to ensure that it's executed fairly and equitably, but most importantly that the employees have the protection of the law to ensure that they get all the rights that they're entitled to insofar as this process is concerned. I think what's just important to note is that it's the fact that they have a right to be consulted meaningfully about the process so that they can give their inputs in terms of, so that management can take those inputs into account before making any final decisions. And that is the decisions on who gets retrenched, in other words, selection criteria for retrenchment. They also get to have an input insofar as the separation package is concerned. They get to give the employer input. Although, as I've said, is that this is a consultative process, and therefore, in the end, the employer retains the right to make that final decision.
Is there a stipulated time in the Employment Act about how soon or how early an employer should notify their employee about the fact that they're contemplating retrenchment, as you said, that first initial step there?
There is no specific time that is mentioned by the Act. The legal requirement is that you have to give the employees sufficient prior warning of the contemplated or impending retrenchment. What it is that you have to ensure that there's reasonable time that you've given for the process that the law requires. The process would involve consulting employees on all those different areas that the law says employees must be consulted on. So reasonable time would depend on, have you given the employees sufficient time to be able to engage with them, to be able to report back to their principals, to be able to do, if they need to research on anything that you've mentioned, did they get enough time to go and get all the information that they require in order for them to engage with you meaningfully. So it really just needs to be reasonable.
That's that for our conversation with Sethunya. Feel free to share your thoughts, questions, or comments on this topic with us via social media. Hashtag First Issues. Do stay tuned for more. Welcome back to First Issues. The majority of us have wondered out loud with varying degrees of frustration why it is we are asked over and over again for our personal details, always with supporting documents, regardless of which bank we have chosen to entrust our money to. Whether you've been banking there for years, whether you're opening your third or fourth account, you are required to prove time and time again that you are who you say you are, you do indeed live at that stated address, and that you are actually gainfully employed at such and such a place. It is most definitely a nuisance, but our guest this evening insists that it is an important and necessary measure and not the indication of ineptitude or inefficiency that most of us suspected it was. We live in a global world, one in which the fight to curtail criminal activities being supported by money laundering is gaining momentum, where regulations spanning the globe are looking to ensure that financial institutions such as our banks do not support human trafficking, terrorism, drug cartels, corruption, and so on. So therefore, it appears we may have to live with these sometimes inconvenient security measures for the foreseeable future. Lesego Bannabotlhe of First National Bank Botswana explains the international anti-money laundering banking regulation that has had the most impact on consumers' interactions with their banks, known simply as the Know Your Customer or KYC initiative.
Know Your Customer, or KYC as it's commonly known, is the process of banks identifying and verifying their customers' details. The main objective of KYC is to ensure that banks or other financial institutions are not used for money laundering activities. This is a legal requirement and is governed and mandated by the Financial Intelligence Act of 2009, the Financial Intelligence Regulations of 2013, and the Banking Anti-Money Laundering Regulations of 2003. Each financial institution is required to have a KYC policy in place that would outline what the requirements are. This is not just the process in place to protect the client, it's also to ensure that the bank or the financial institution can better understand the customer needs as well as the financial requirements of that specific customer, and thus enable the bank to be more helpful to the customer.
Don't customers submit such documents when opening accounts with their relevant financial service provider? Why ask for such details once again?
The KYC documents from customers are not only required at account opening, but also throughout the life cycle of the relationship. So yes, people may ask, I've already provided these documents to the bank. Why do I need to do it again? It is a requirement that throughout the life of the relationship between the bank and the customer, all records are continuously updated. Thus, we encourage all customers to ensure that they contact their bank and ensure that they provide these documents.
What repercussions are there for being non-compliant? What penalties, if any, should customers look out for?
There are different methods of penalizing. There's account freezing, where the bank is actually required then to ensure that the customer is unable to transact on their account. And this is within the bank's mandate, and as previously said, this is a legal requirement.
Is there a warning before such measures are taken? Are you notified in some way or other before your account is frozen, for example?
Banks will normally contact their customers to ask them to bring in the required documentation, either by SMS or by calls. Customers will be given an opportunity over a specific period to bring in their documentation, failure of which will result in their account being frozen as per the legal requirement.
Are these new requirements? Why the emphasis now?
I want to highlight that this is not a new requirement. This is an existing requirement that has been mandated by the Financial Intelligence Act of 2009, the Financial Intelligence Regulations of 2013, and Bank of Botswana anti-money laundering regulations of 2003. And I wish to urge all customers to ensure that they are compliant, to bring in all the required documentation. Customers who would like to get more information should contact their nearest bank or branch in order to ensure that they are fully compliant and to avoid their account being frozen.
We've discussed what the consequences of non-compliances are for the customer, but what about the bank itself?
Banks have been fined millions of dollars internationally for weak money laundering controls, for example, not having their customers' KYC documents updated. Locally, there have also been some fines. And I want to emphasize that the liability does not just fall on the financial institution. It also falls on the individuals within the institution. For example, your compliance officer, your chief risk officer, and your chief executive officer, just to name a few.
For customers that may be not too cooperative or not too understanding about this entire process, can you remind them once again as to the importance of following these anti-money laundering regulatory procedures?
It is important that customers update their records on a continuous basis, being their KYC documents, to ensure that the bank can protect them from, for example, being potentially mistaken for a sanctioned individual. I'll give you an example. We had a customer who transferred funds to an entity outside the country, which had been put on the international watch list, unbeknownst to the customer. The bank that received the funds then referred to the sending banks to ask for more details about this customer. What they wanted to understand and verify was whether this customer from Botswana was actually linked to that terrorist group internationally. Now, because the customer had provided all the details, we knew this customer very well. We were able to provide information and documentation that then were able to convince the authorities that this customer had sent these funds unwittingly. Another customer we had was transacting facelessly, refused to come to the branch to actually provide their KYC documents, and they were transferring funds to high-risk areas outside the country. The result was that the authorities froze this account. And because this customer had not updated their records and was not cooperative, we were not able to defend them. And this resulted in their account being frozen for quite a long time.
Now that you understand that not complying with that request to update your personal details could bring about penalties for you, the person assisting you at the bank, and the overall institution, we trust that you'll be moving that trip to your nearest branch much higher on your list of priorities. That brings us to the end of our program. Make sure to visit the First Issues Facebook page to stay abreast of our activities. You can also participate in the ongoing Facebook poll to help us improve our offering to you. With that, we bid you good night.